Hi, everybody. Hope you are well. It's been good to see some of you during office hours, and I always appreciate when you show up, or even if you can't show up, given how busy everybody is. Um, and it's been wonderful pouring through your submissions. And my update for you now is that I'm about 85% of the way through, and I should finish the final four or five submissions. Later tonight or tomorrow. So thanks in advance for your patience and feel free to reach out with questions. But I really appreciate pouring into your lit reviews, your problem statements, and your revisions, which is that's what where the work is your ability to kind of take the feedback and think about how you refine the problem and what resources might improve or strengthen or buttress your problem statement and what gaps you're discovering. I want to get into a little bit of that and provide some helpful resources and reminders about the next kind of 2 or 3 weeks because time is moving fast. I hope you'll just give me kind of 15 minutes and then I'll be done with this kind of brief, presentation, informal presentation. Um, as a substitute for actually formally seeing you again. So let me share the screen. Okay, all right. So I came across some old pictures of one of the sites I did research on. My topic, as I told many of you, was on the history and practice of democratic education and the prevalence of um, radical traditions and their impact on student voice, youth voice. And one of the schools I researched was a really interesting humanistic alternative school in Los Angeles called the Angeles Workshop School. And one of their goals was to develop political and class consciousness for working class students. And they were private, technically, they weren't charter, but at the same time, they were not cost prohibitive and they were deliberately accessible, deliberately small, as a lot of experimental schools are. And they were situated within an urban context. In my own review of the literature, I discovered that many of the experimental schools, like Summerhill, many of the other ones, Sudbury schools, were located in remote contexts, not urban contexts, that people critiqued as being kind of self-enclosed oases away from urban questions of power and more diverse student populations. So this model at Angeles sought to overturn that, and I thought it was really, really interesting to explore in terms of its impact on youth voice, and not just voice in a political sense, but as I've mentioned before, in like an ontological sense, how they become persons, how they discover their voice. And part of the research process is not just asking questions, doing focus groups, getting your IRB approved so you know how to do research among vulnerable populations over long periods of time. You know how to collect data. You know how to trouble what data is or what data is telling you. I took a lot of pictures of the built environment. I also spent some time researching the A school in New York, Scarsdale Alternative School, because they are a democratic school, but they're a little bit more representative and representative in terms of representative democracy. And they operate using the just community model, which is all about deliberating over issues of social, ethical, and moral concerns within the school. And I was interested in how, their notions of justice and fairness were impacted by being in a democratic school context. There's not a lot of evidence for that, which it's important for me to kind of take up. This is my own archive that I kept during my research process, and I realized that I did have one. And these are just notes I took whenever I visited a different school site. And I actually created a diagram here because I wanted to capture what I said was a lot of transgressive voices in of the background, indicative of youth voice, linguistic codes, ways of knowing. And then I wrote here a reference to Christopher Emden, who's a scholar of urban education and hip hop, and Irish Shore. And I think I mentioned something about student voice and equity and race being relevant to who gets heard. So anyway, this is like an open-ended document, exactly like you're keeping, that was helpful for me to record my thinking in progress. There's more of it. This was an interview I did with an alumni because I was interested not just in students' experiences in these schools, but what happened to them afterwards, because they're wasn't a lot of anecdotal or qualitative evidence around how it impacted them. And I felt like that was a gap in the literature. Jasper was an amazing interview. Sometimes you come across a subject who tells you everything. Oftentimes you get a subject that tells you nothing. That's part of the challenge. This is the question I posed around my research early on when I was, a little green. But you know, Megan at the time looked at the question and she said, "Great, but what do you mean around pedagogical tools that help students grow as individuals and community persons?" And when I said I was interested in the impact of democratic school experiences on students' perceptions of justice, fairness, and caring, what theoretical tradition? Are you talking about John Rawls? Are you talking about um, Nell Noddings? Are you talking about bell hooks? I was like, what? So part of it is just making sure you're grounding everything in theory and focusing it so it's not so broad and conceptual, but it's something that can be studied. And this is a video I took of Arun, one of the students.
The Judge Corrigan, it's a complete no yes votes. Unanimously no. Is that 15? 15. 15 yes votes on that. 13, I think there was only yes votes? There were only yes votes and one abstention. One no.
I share that because number one, it reminds me of the data collection process. Um, and because Arun, this particular student, frustrated my notions of political voice. In other words, I was operating under the presumption that political voice was something you acquire as you get older. You acquire more knowledge, more confidence, more maturity, hence the 11th or 12th grader that becomes student body president. But there are a lot of researchers who study political agency in early childhood education and other spaces, and also trouble how we understand what political agency means. And what was powerful about Arun is, in contrast to some of the other students in the school who were, interested in other things, you know, game design and geography or humanities, writing, poetry. Here was this eighth grader at the time, because it was like grade 7 through 12, who was more politically engaged than everybody else, and so it helped me really appreciate that developmental approaches to citizenship oftentimes presume a kind of a linear pathway when in reality it was something a little bit more dynamic and recursive, and my research had to attend to that and attend to what I was learning about this, about voice through the experiences of Arun. And I interviewed him afterwards and learned about his experiences transitioning from a play-based school to a more political one and how that impacted him and what he cares about. And that was super cool.
No vote.
Okay. All right. So before I get into some examples, I just wanted to highlight things that are due May 12th. So the problem statement, which you've already submitted to me and you revised, and I encourage you to keep on revising them. Oftentimes you revise them as your sources begin to tell you something about your problem that you hadn't yet anticipated. I already see that happening. But you're thinking about, again, the context for the problem, the background for this problem, the contributing factors, what factors are influencing this problem. You're thinking about it on a systems level. How are these factors interacting to perpetuate or exacerbate some sort of inequity or a tension? And what is your question? What do you seek to understand? And many of you have done that. And I've pushed and prodded folks to think about the question a little bit more explicitly and think about it in terms of a practitioner perspective, what needs to change, but also a scholastic one. What do you seek to understand about the issue? Those are two separate ones and they can be connected. Or oftentimes, you ultimately have to choose which feels more meaningful. And by choose, I mean ultimately choose, not now. Annotated bibliography, lit exploration. Theory of action proposal is totally optional. People have sent me theirs, but you don't need to do it. And when you do it, it's conjecturish. In other words, like, what would you need to do to collect data or learn more about the problem that you posed? And if you've already dug into the research process a bit more, feel free to do that. But again, Dr. Kenny Graves will go into that in greater detail. And you're going to share a reflection. Those reflection questions are meant for you to sort of think about how the research process or the reading process has refined or opened up avenues in terms of what you're thinking about studying or what you find interesting or what you find challenging. So take a look at those. But again, it's a little bit more open-ended. It's for you. And please do cite the sources, any sources that you use in your reflection using APA. And then I would also like you to share your multimodal archive, but primarily for me to track the evolution of your thinking. In other words, like as long as you're keeping it update, that's fine. And everything that you've submitted thus far is high quality, and I love, being inside your thinking. It's super cool. Okay, so let me move out of this for a moment and into a. Let's see if this is it. Okay. Okay, should I be able to focus, focus, focus? Okay, there we go. Okay. So as I mentioned before, here are the different elements that you've already worked on, but if you need any kind of reminding, it's there for you on the on Canvas. More about the final reflection essay. What did you learn about your problem? How did course readings inform how you think about them? What kind of questions are you now drawn to exploring? And then timeline, what's due is a problem statement, annotated bibliography, theory of action is proposal, reflection, and your multimodal archive. Okay, so on to the good stuff. I wanted to provide a few samples, and I'll share more from other contexts and settings. But I thought I would actually draw from this class with the permission of a few students to highlight what I thought were really effective problem statements and also share some of the feedback that I gave the students in terms of how they could further develop their work. So I'm beginning with Monica. Thank you, Monica, for allowing me to take up your problem statement, which she titles Assessing Excellence in a Changing Context, Tiered Grading Equity, and Ways of Knowing at VP and S. What I appreciate about this is she is providing a background or a context for the problem. And you can do it certainly anecdotally, but she is also now grounding it in the literature based on what she's read. Grading in medical education is never simply a technical exercise. It communicates what we value, how we define excellence, and so forth. At VPS, tiered grading has long functioned as a primary mechanism through which student performance conveys meaning for external audiences. Grades also shape learners' understandings of accomplishment and belonging. As medical education continues to move towards competency-based frameworks, place great emphasis on demonstrating competence, questions concerning gradings have become increasingly urgent. Okay, so it's leading into a problem. Here's a history, but we're moving into something that's vexing. Now, here comes the actual question, which is very explicit, which I encourage everyone to look and see and test your ability to actually say your question and not worry too much if it's perfect. So the question here, according to Monica, is how should VPNS examine and refine its approach to tiered grading in light of evolving residency selection expectations, a shifting policy landscape, and the need to remain educationally sound and operationally sustainable? And in the rest of this statement, she has also gone into another set of challenges. Here in particular is concerns around equity and the fact that these approaches to tiered grading don't often capture the experiences of historically underrepresented groups. Many of these students describe the system as stressful, at times opaque, and not always experienced as equitable, raising concerns about the consistency, clarity of criteria, and the cumulative impact of distinctions, which in turn impacts trust. Later, she goes into diverse epistemologies and ways of knowing, because clearly, if you're looking at tiered forms of grading, how does it presume a certain form of knowledge? You kind of explore different forms of knowing and ways of knowing. And here she has something which I find really powerful, which you may encounter in your own research, is a reference to epistemic injustice. Let me just bold it here. When experiential narrative or community-derived knowledge is discounted, very important, learners, particularly those from historically underrepresented groups in medicine, may experience what has been described as epistemic injustice. In these cases, assessments may unintentionally privilege certain expressions of competence while obscuring others that are equally relevant to clinical practice. Epistemic having to do with knowledge, the injustice of privileging one knowledge over the other. So I thought this was great. And one thing that I asked her to do, but it's implicit in the rest of her statement, is her question itself is great. How should VPS examine and refine its approach to tiered grading in light of evolving residency expectations, shifting policy landscape, in order to remain educationally sound and operationally sustainable? I really wanted her to add a question or see if she could enrich this particular question with some of these other important problems that she's getting to a little bit later around equity and around ways of knowing, because it's clearly not simply just to remain educationally sound and operationally sustainable, but to be equitable. So that's up for Monica to take, and always my feedback is always suggestive. But what we have here is a great problem statement rooted in the literature, and this was followed by her own annotated bibliography. Okay, so I'm going to move to Perry. And thank you, Perry, as well, for agreeing to be a guinea pig here. And Perry's problem statement is really, really, really sophisticated and vast in scope in an exciting way, but also in a challenging way. So the central inquiry, so here's where Perry explicitly names the question. The central inquiry guides this project. Okay, how have successive education reforms designed to advance equity been translated into institutional practice? Okay, how has it gone from the reform level to the practice level within where? Not everywhere, the Mississippi Delta. And in talking to Perry, Perry was really interested in thinking about the study within a context that was a little bit more unusual and that was not amenable to prescriptive or confirmation bias results. So maybe this work has been done in New York and LA. What about the Mississippi Delta? And through what processes have these reforms produced continuity across reform eras? Embedded within this inquiry is a second related concern. How are the moral commitments encoded within these reforms, claims about equity, responsibility, and democratic participation, and a lot more? So Perry's deep interest is about education reform. He's suggesting here that it's designed to advance equity, but in many ways it's just producing continuity and upholding the status quo. And around this is a related question around the moral commitments about equity, responsibility, and democratic participation, because the language of reform, both at the level of policy and at the level of practice, uses language which seems about equity, but oftentimes undermines it. So that's a question. Now, the challenge that Perry has, which is a good one, but he says he wants to trace reform across three policy eras: desegregation, standards-based accountability, and school choice, three policy periods, examining how each reform stated commitments to equity are taken up, mediated across institutional levels, stabilized across time, and think about it through the interaction of policy design, institutional conditions, and the normative commitments of morality that underwrite reform itself. This is really, really powerful. But here, this may be a scope that's way too wide. And so one of the things that I mentioned to Perry is consider narrowing down the policy periods instead of around three to one and two, one to two, and try and think about what specifically you'd like to focus on and analyze. Because if you have policy design, normative commitments that underwrite reform, institutional conditions, that's a lot of work and that's really, really complex. So part of it is simplifying and understanding that a lot of the things may actually come up in the research process. But what your committee eventually wants to see is a simple statement and then a consideration later on about how it can be studied. And it's possible that Perry can say, I'm going to actually preserve this as long as you have a study to match it. But oftentimes it's hard to have a methodology and a data collection process when you're studying reform across three different reform eras, right? How are you going to get your focus group or your survey or your archive when you're transcending time in that way. But it's been done, and Perry's up to it. And again, this is all feedback that students can take in different ways. Finally, I love going through your annotated bibliography. Again, some of you have the benefit of having, sourcing that immediately aligns and supports your overall statement around, let's say, feedback or school culture or dealing with a breach in trust and how conceptions of trust are developed and challenged. Um, and for people working in the independent school world, sometimes you encounter a lot of practitioner-oriented journals and reflections, which are great, but oftentimes don't have that same empirical heft. So I encourage you to keep those. Those are fine, but you're always looking for peer-reviewed journals, even if they're not necessarily about the independent school world. That's fine. But if they're about a concept, let's say burnout, it may be relevant. So here, Perry has Paulo Freire with his classic seminal text, Pedagogy of the Press, and he's explaining why it's relevant for him because it distinguishes education as a practice of freedom versus domination. I view this work as instrumental in the epistemological grounding for understanding the aims of education reform. It's not to position young people, especially from marginalized identities, as participants and actors. It's subjects of their learning. And I'm asking a central question from here. If education is a practice of freedom, then what are the moral stakes of reform? And how does education claim to do, or what does it claim to do when it names justice as its modus operandi? He's got Gloria Ladson Billings, which is always a good thing because she refers in her work to inequality as both a historical and structural debt. And then finally, he's got a really, really, really amazing scholar who's written just the best books. I am such a fan, Saidiya Hartman. And she writes in her work about what she calls the afterlife of slavery and how the afterlife of slavery, even the ghosts of slavery, still impact and shape how we understand educational reform. And so, one of the things I asked Perry to do is make that link a little bit more explicit in terms of not just the power of a concept like the afterlife of slavery, but its really deep, specific connection to what was happening in the Mississippi Delta. Um, and the final thing I want to say is something that was optional, but some people did. Once you've gone through your annotated bibliography and you're like, all right, I want to go back to my problem statement. Um, you step back and you analyze patterns, like where were the most credible and compelling forms of evidence? Was it in this kind of piece from 35 years ago, or is that not relevant? Or is it in this particular article with a really, really powerful framework? Right, Nancy, I think, had who's really taking up questions of belonging in Hawaii. There are sources that take that up almost perfectly, and others that do it in other contexts. In other words, like how belonging is taken up in other contexts, which are characterized by dislocation and change, global and international education. So it's not going to be the same as Hawaii, but it offers an interesting counterpoint. What voices are missing, right? Looking at across all of these sources, whose perspectives are underrepresented or are absent, and where do you need to go to find voices that can actually help provide the grounding that you may need? And sometimes it's difficult, especially when you're dealing with questions of indigeneity and place and belonging, that there are too many gatekeepers that are preventing access to what feels like worthwhile. And there it can be helpful. Evidence gap, what aspects of your problem need stronger evidence, what additional sources you will search for. But where there's a gap, that's great. That's where you're going to live. So don't stress out if you found a gap and you're like, no, sometimes a gap's a gap, or sometimes you just need to kind of rethink how things are going. Okay, so that's really it. And just as a reminder, again, like the most important part of your problem statement is the thing that you find most vexing, most ethically challenging, most mysterious, and most elusive. And so what that means is you're always posing a question in your statement that's explicit and that's rooted in what you really want to know and don't know now, and you're willing to be surprised by. So continue to do that. And great work. And I'll have more updates to share soon, including the recording from this office hours last week, which I haven't shared, but I'll hold office hours again this week too. Love, peace, justice to all of you. You're fantastic. And I'll be seeing you soon, end of June, back in the city. Take care.